It's been so hard to compete with this program, music, yesterday's after party, and there's a bald man before me speaking, so it's just, it's interesting. So it's morning time and hard to wake up, so let's start with some Jeopardy to get you guys waking up. And I'm just gonna run some facts with you. The highest density of startups in the world, if you see one startup per 2,000 people. More companies listed on NASDAQ than any other country outside the US, besides China. More venture capital per capita than any other country. Highest ratio of engineers and PhDs per capita. And an incredible amount of Nobel Prize winners. So if you haven't guessed, and Paul mentioned the country I'm from, Israel, and my name is Saul Reichman, and hopefully we'll have 20 minutes of good time, and I'll tell you about the Israeli startup ecosystem. And you've got my contact details, and you're always welcome to contact me, and it's a pleasure being here, and thank you for the hosts, Eliza, Yenjay, for introducing me to Eliza, and let's get started. So let's look at Israel at a glance. The country is really small, and here you've got some boring facts. Let's look at some, we're in Poland, so if you look at Israel as a state and Poland around it, the country is definitely small. And let's look at some interesting facts that you may not know. So although I was very impressed that in Warsaw you've got many sushi restaurants and bars, apparently after Tokyo and New York City, Tel Aviv hosts many sushi restaurants. We've got many Bauhaus buildings, the lowest place on earth, the Dead Sea. If you haven't been and you've got skin problems, that's where you should come. Also, if you like to float. We've got the Sea of Galilee, which is the lowest freshwater lake in the world. This I didn't know, and I've been living in Tel Aviv for more than a decade. More museums and orchestras per capita than any other country. And I guess I'm the only one here speaking Hebrew, but Hebrew was a dead language, and the only language actually that was revived. So some interesting facts I hope you'll take with you. So, you may have heard as Israel being a startup nation. Hopefully, if you look at these companies, you'll see and be surprised that all of them were made in Israel. So if you look at the companies, you see a wide selection, and you see a range starting from pharmaceuticals to IT, life sciences, agriculture, cybersecurity, new media, so very, very diverse. And let's look at Israel GDP per capita compared to the world. And everybody these days are talking about GDP. And the reason why, and of course, every country wants to increase its GDP. Of course, if you've got natural resources, that's an excellent way to increase your GDP. And you have a country like Norway that has natural resources, and unsurprisingly, you see them on top. But the reason that we are all looking and interested about talking on innovation is because through innovation we are able to increase the workforce, we are able to increase productivity of workforce, and this is what every country wants at the end of the day to gain. So I was invited here to talk about Israel, but mainly to understand the platform for innovation whereby Israel actually has shown success when it comes to innovation. So let's look at the ingredients for success. So we've got some seasoned investment ecosystem, and I'll talk about all these factors throughout my talk today. We've got government support, R&D, human capital, successful Israeli tech companies, and that's always good when you want to show success stories, and multinational companies. So this is my take on the success factors actually showing Israel's platform for innovation. So let's start with R&D. If we look at Israel, the country leads the world in terms of R&D, and you look at the numbers, the R&D as a percentage of the GDP, Israel spends a lot on R&D, almost 5%, and 25 billion US dollars in technological exports annually. Israel being ranked the first place for business expenditure on R&D. One of the reasons why we are doing this so well is synergy. You see the academia, the government, the industry, all understanding that R&D is crucial, and really the synergy coming together with all parties in various ways, and I'll be speaking about this shortly. Let's look at human capital, which is very interesting, and I try to list as many factors as possible. So really the number of scientists, technicians, per 10,000 workers is quite incredible. We've got a high number. Like you saw during our Jeopardy quiz this morning that I hope woke you up. We've got a high number of engineers, the highest in the world. More than 25% of the workforce employed in technical professions. And of course, patents being filed, the third in ranking, and lots of scientific journals and papers being published. So let's understand the factors supporting the brain trust, and this is very unique, and I would say very unique to Israel. We've got the Jewish education, and there are many in Israel Polish Jews, and you know a lot of this is coming actually from Poland historically. So the acceptance to ask questions, that is something that within our society, that's something that you can ask. You're not you don't need to be shy asking questions. You can doubt. That is something that is actually very encouraged from an early age. We've got the Jewish mother factor. You know, if you're a Jewish mother, you want your son or daughter to either be a lawyer, to be a doctor, and so the emphasis is always on education, and that is something that you see starting from a young age, going to school and later on to university. Luckily, during the 90s, after the communist era, with the breakdown of the USSR, of Russia, we had a very huge immigration, and when I'm saying huge in Israeli numbers, it was extraordinary. We had 1 million Russian immigrants from the post-USSR coming over. Of course, most of them were very skilled, and this brought a flux of brain gain to the country, and still does. We've got a compulsory military service, the Israel Defense Force, and you know, I'm not being militant, but the fact that you have this melting pot and you bring people together doesn't necessarily unite them, but actually creates many skills that you want later on from an entrepreneur regarding leadership, regarding focus on technology in general, regarding innovation. So this is actually something that, as you know, speaking broadly, many kids, many young people are actually infused with this enthusiasm at a very young age. And of course, the necessity as the mother of innovation. Israel lacks natural resources. In that way, we're a small country, very isolated. We have a tiny market. So from day one, you understand that you have to go abroad. And of course, this requires you to think outside of the box. And this is what's very unique. You got also if you look back in history, many immigrants coming to Israel created something that they wanted coming back from Eastern European countries, kibbutzim, the kibbutz system, and that really infused Israel's industry. So from a very early standpoint, you see a lot of innovation, and that's unique. One thing that, you know, I try to think how to phrase it, but I hope you guys know this. Entrepreneurs are crazy people in general. They think outside of the box. And we've got the Israeli chutzpah, and I can't really define it in English, but it's like, if you try to define it, it's being the ability to be informal, to be very direct, to get down to business, be very tachlis. And that's something that I think entrepreneurs in Israel all share. We've got many immigrants from different areas of the world that creates a melting pot like the US. So in a way, you actually encourage multiculturalism, diversity, and you need this in a startup. You need this being an entrepreneur. You need to understand people from different areas of the world, especially if you want to be global and you want to go large scale. And one key element that is very crucial when looking into the entrepreneurial culture, and that's being able to fail. And there is a very large acceptance to failing, the ability to try and fail and keep on moving. This is something that even, when meeting entrepreneurs, you want to work with serial entrepreneurs, not necessarily just working with those successful entrepreneurs, those that have experience. And the ability to fail in understanding and learning from mistakes is something that is very encouraged in Israel. So let's look at government support. And from a very early standpoint, the government realized that it needs to take part in this. So understanding that a resilient economy actually ensures security for investors and brings investors to the country. So when you look at R&D funding, taxation, trade, the government has really looked into what it can do, and not just one office or one ministry took part in this. Various ministries understanding that they need to work together to really support the startup, the innovation ecosystem in Israel. Let's look at multinationals, and that is something that understanding that if you want to encourage investments, if you want to encourage a startup ecosystem, you need to look at the whole value chain. And looking at the whole value chain, you need to look at also multinationals. The world is becoming global, flat, very small, especially if you're a tiny country such as Israel. You need to attract those multinationals, because in today's world, being global and not having boundaries or borders when it comes to doing business, you need to attract those multinationals, and most countries are trying to attract those multinationals. So with that respect, Israel did a lot regarding laws for the encouragement of capital, industrial R&D, signing bilateral agreements, and creating a fertile ground for multinationals to work. And that starts with sophisticated communication systems, reliable energy infrastructure, well-developed transportation systems, protection of trademarks. That's something that you don't see in other countries, and that's something that is, of course, crucial if you want to attract those multinational corporations. And the ability to license technologies quickly, or a legal system that is based on common and corporate law. So all these factors together have brought a huge pool of multinationals to Israel. This started initially by those multinationals coming to Israel and creating R&D centers. Through R&D centers, because like I mentioned previously, Israel has a huge workforce of PhDs and engineers. But gradually over time, those multinationals are also looking outside of their corporations and looking into innovation within Israel. So you've got a huge pool of multinationals, and if you look at the this is just a small list of companies. They range from transportation to IT, looking into communications, medical devices, energy. Very, very diverse. Let's look at some successful Israel tech companies. And being a tiny market, you want to go where all the big guys are. So we have already around 60 Israeli companies listed on NASDAQ. Besides China, Israel is number 2. And that, of course, encourages a lot of trade, a lot of assures investors that there is a way to go about outside of Israel. And, going IPO is not something local, not just within the Israeli local stock exchange. So this is very encouraging for investors. Let's look at somewhere where I'm actually coming from, and that's the Israeli VC ecosystem, the angel, the investment ecosystem in Israel. So Israel has almost 30 years of VC industry background. And there are many significant contributors to the economy, GDP, export, and employment, which have actually come together to create the Israeli VC industry. Israel to date has more than 5,000 startups that have been established. Most of them in Tel Aviv, some of them in Jerusalem and Haifa, today also in Beersheba, the south capital of Israel, where actually you have a very big pool of cybersecurity related companies. Because we started during the 90s with the Yozma approach, you can imagine that the VC industry has changed over time, and you look at different waves. So I try to divide those waves, and I think it's best to maybe try to look at them through 6 different waves, starting from the pioneer years, looking into growth, expansion, consolidation, maturity. We're at a stage where we're looking now at post-maturity, where in general the VC ecosystem globally is undergoing change, looking at different business models through crowdfunding, through microfunds, super angels, having more and more corporates doing corporate venturing. All this actually also affects Israel, and the VC ecosystem in Israel has been affected. The world is becoming global, so for Israeli VCs, it's harder to be unique because they're competing with foreign VCs, with global VCs. And this is something that any country looking into growing a VC ecosystem, of course, needs to understand. And of course, if you want to talk to me later about this, I'm more than happy to go into details. So just trying to color this slide a bit, we really have a big ecosystem. And if you look at the different approaches, you've got seed-related investment houses, VCs, growth and buyout funds. I didn't list all the corporate venturing teams that are based in Israel, such as Google Ventures, Samsung Ventures. They're all active. So all this really creating that ecosystems. Of course, you have these days something that is very popular, and you see this also in Poland, incubators, accelerators, all this contributing to Israel's investment ecosystem. So if I want to summarize, and this is I've got only 20 minutes, and I hope that I'm on time, but the highest VC investment per capita is in Israel, ranked number 2 after Silicon Valley. It's hard these days to compete because the world is global. Entrepreneurs, they go where their money is, and in today's world, you've got London, you've got Berlin, you've got Munich, you've got many interesting places also in Asia where entrepreneurs understand that they can go. And today is a good time to be an entrepreneur, meaning it's more easier for entrepreneurs to reach capital, to go where the money is. It's harder to be an investor because you are competing with many talented investment houses that really have very interesting track records. So that's relating to Israel. At the end of the day, you're probably thinking, okay, so you're an Israeli startup, or in general, being a startup, you have mainly 2 pathways, either being going through an IPO pathway, or going through an M&A strategy route. If we look at the exits, this is quite remarkable. We've got, in 2014, that was last year, 99 companies that exited, and the exit amount was almost $7 billion US. Really, the one very popular story, Google buying Waze, an Israeli-based social GPS system. This is just expected to rise, and you see the volatility, and it's not always stable because the world is global, and in 2008 we all suffered from an economic turmoil that also affected Israel as well, to some extent. So That's the end of my talk. But I just wanted to sum this up by also showing you a short film. It's like a 2.5-minute film. Some of the topics you already saw during my presentation. If you want to learn more about Israel, I'm happy to talk to you after the presentation. And there's an excellent book called Startup Nation, and it's worth reading it and better understanding factors that I described to you. So let's start with the film.
I'm Dash Deshpande. I'm an entrepreneur in high technology. I grew up in India, so when I say
Sorry, can you stop it?
I
This is
came
not
to
the
this country with $8.
That's about India.
Oops.
We'll just stop at this point because this is a different.
Is that not the movie you were expecting?
No.
I don't know. Guys, do you have another?
This is an excellent film, but it's about India, and I was.
Yeah,
I want to show you about Israel.
I wasn't sure. Do you guys have the other film or not? Nope. So, well, we'll maybe run it later then. Okay? Well, you can, yeah,
It's
you
okay.
can applaud
Thank
him.
you.
Sorry for that. Thank you, Saul.